Hi, we're down at Speaker's Corner here. We've moved away from the crowd so that we can do a proper debate with not enough people yelling and screaming and all the rest. We're going to do a debate that's a little different than we've done in the past. We're going to talk about the existence of God. We have two protagonists here. We have our friend from Speaker's Corner, who we know very well, and then we have Jonathan McCLATCHIE from Newcastle. John McCLATCHIE is going to argue that that God does exist, and you're going to argue that God does not exist.
No, I'm going to argue that the evidence isn't convincing.
The evidence is not convincing, where he believes the evidence is convincing. So we're going to move right into it. It won't be timed. This will just be a back and forth, like a conversation, like a dialogue, back and forth between the two of you. Go ahead. Who wants to start? John?
Shall I? You go ahead, John.
Okay.
Patrick,
would you call yourself an atheist?
Sort of Wittgenstein agnostic.
I'm just trying to get a handle on what.
Yeah, Wittgenstein agnostic, like accept the possibility that it might be happening, but more up the kind of Platonic avenue of sort of a God that is not personal. I'm willing to accept the possibility of a non-personal God. So I wouldn't call myself a sort of strict Dawkins atheist, but I would say I'm ultimately sufficiently far down that spectrum of agnosticism that you wouldn't recognise me as a theist.
So would it be?
That's a long answer to a simple question.
Would it be your position that there's no evidence for God, or simply insufficient evidence for God?
I would say there is insufficient evidence for a personal God of the nature that you and other religious people, other believers, would state exists. There's not enough evidence.
So you do believe there's evidence for God, you just don't believe there's sufficient evidence for God, is that right?
Well, evidence would be sufficient, right? There are things that could be construed as evidence, but they ultimately don't meet the standard required.
Okay, because under a Bayesian understanding of evidence is something which raises the probability of a proposition being true, or is more expected on the hypothesis being true than on the antithesis.
If you're a Bayesian.
Yeah, exactly, which I am. So
okay.
Yeah. So
I don't accept. I mean, if we're going to get into Bayesianism, like the whole idea of probability is massively intellectually difficult and philosophically problematic.
Could you define what you mean?
So Bayesianism is basically, there's a guy called Thomas Baynes who's a mathematician in the 19th century who came up with this theory called the Baynes theorem, and basically he believes that probabilities exist, and you can have he accepts the idea that you can probabilistically believe something. So you can flip a coin, cover it up, and say it's 50% likelihood that it's a heads, right? But probability absolutists would say, actually, that coin is heads or it's tails. There's actually a 0% probability. Let's say it's heads. There's actually a 0% possibility that it's tails, and there's a 100% possibility that it's heads. So is that a fair?
So a Bayesian understanding of evidence would basically say that that something counts as evidence for the hypothesis H if and only if the probability of that evidence is greater on the hypothesis than on the antithesis of that hypothesis, i.e. the hypothesis being wrong.
It's quite a closed definition of Bayesianism, but all right.
Okay, that's how Bayesians understand evidence.
John, we need more volume.
Okay, that's how a Bayesian would understand what evidence is, what counts as evidence.
That's how you would understand Bayesians to understand.
Right, yeah, exactly. But yeah, I was just interested in getting a feel for where you're coming from. So
I mean, look. The point I'm making is that there are extraordinary claims made, right? There is a metaphysical, there's a spiritual universe, a spiritual world that is beyond our comprehension, and inside that spiritual universe is a being that is very human-like and looks a lot like a father. I suppose most of the religions seem to have this idea, and there's contact back and forth between the spiritual non-physical world and the physical world. And not only that, but there's a book that kind of an associated belief system. That is a very, very extraordinary claim. So the level of evidence required is really very, very high.
Well, the proposition of theism simplicator does not necessarily maintain that Christianity is true. You could be a non-Christian theist.
That's true, right? But I'm in my defence. You told me before you're a Christian. Yeah. I'm giving you Christian context, right?
Because arguing for Christianity being true requires a different approach than arguing that God exists.
Right, but the problem is that the word God in English has all sorts of Christian overtones. So, if we want to debate about the idea that there's some spiritual other power outside of our physical universe, I'd probably say to you, I don't know. I'd probably put my hands up and say, but that's not the kind of context of this conversation, especially at Speaker's Corner, is not that.
Okay.
The context is a ever-present, ever-loving, ultimate, infinite God. Whether you're talking about Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and frankly, like the other religions, they are all interested in the idea of a personal God.
Sure.
Or gods.
Let's start by looking at some of the evidence then and just get your thoughts on it.
If you don't mind, let's start with a definition of God.
Okay, sure. So God is an immensely intelligent agency that exists outside of our time and space matter continuum. That is to say that he is trans-temporal, spaceless, immaterial, and personal. And by that I mean kind of outside of time, space, and matter.
He's a man as well.
No, he's not a man. No.
So it would be more.
It
would be more grammatically fair.
Well, if by man you mean human being, no, he's not a man.
Well, he is used in English. He is used for male humans.
Christians in the Bible, God reveals himself as being his father, and so in that sense, one could say he reveals himself as masculine.
But you've asked me to abandon Christian context.
But God is not a sexual being, so in that sense, he has no gender.
Okay,
right.
So it, for the purpose of this conversation, it would be more accurate.
If you want to say that, I mean, I would say he because it's personal and not simply an entity.
And he's intelligent.
Intelligent.
So thinking, conscious.
Right, that's right.
Trans-temporal.
Eternal.
Eternal.
Never began to exist. Exists out of the necessity of its own nature.
I mean, these are some extraordinary claims, right?
Right.
I mean, the idea of infinite, the idea that anything's infinite is an extraordinary
Well, we
claim.
have to unpack...
Just that.
We have to unpack what we mean by infinite. See, there's a difference between a quantitative infinite and a qualitative infinite. So God is qualitatively infinite in the sense that he's a maximally great being. He's maximally loving, maximally knowledgeable, and so forth. But he's not quantitatively infinite because there's no such thing as a quantitative infinite. So I'd make that distinction.
Okay.
But do you want to get into some of the evidence for God?
Yeah, by all means.
So the case for the existence of God is a cumulative case. It's not simply a single piece of evidence that's really the clincher. It's a cumulative case that branches multiple lines of scientific inquiry, both the physical and the life sciences. Let's start with the life sciences, since that's my own background.
Do you see arguments against God in there? Like, you see that as like an aggregate? Like, here's his, like on the one side of the scale, here are the arguments against God. On the other side of the scale, here's the arguments for? Or do you see it as just a cumulative case?
Sure, I think that there are other arguments. I think there's evidence on both sides of the scale. Certainly, for example, you might say the problem of evil is evidence for atheism in the sense that the evil is more probable on atheism than on theism. So as a Bayesian, I would consider that perhaps arguably evidence for atheism. The question is it sufficient evidence for atheism? And I would argue that it's not, and I would argue that we do have very compelling evidence for theism, which is far more consistent.
Go on, let's do, what should we do first?
So,
teleological, cosmological?
Well, as my burden of proof, so I have to demonstrate this of God to you. I would start with the life sciences. Let's start.
I understand.
Let's start with the life sciences and then move on to the physical sciences. So, what we found as biologists over the last.
We're speaking for all biologists here.
Yeah, speaking for all biologists, not me personally, but what we found is that that living systems, the cells of your body, and there's about 100 trillion cells in your body, are run and governed by information content. Now, what do I mean by information? By information, I don't just mean, there's different definitions of information in information theory. There's a theorem of information concocted by Claude Shannon, who was a famous mathematician and information theorist in the 20th century. And Shannon information basically relates to reduced uncertainty. So as you reduce the uncertainty, you increase the Shannon information content. When we're dealing with biology, what we find, we find that Shannon information, but we find something which is qualitatively different from mere Shannon information. We find what we call specified complexity, or complex specified information, or CSI for short. And when something which exhibits the property of specified complexity is not only improbable, and by improbable I mean it's so improbable that it exhausts the probabilistic resources at one's disposal, and it's specified in that it conforms to some independently given pattern. So to give an illustration, take an ATM machine. We've all used ATM machines. You put your bank cards into the ATM machine and you dial a 4-digit PIN number on, and there's 10,000 ways of dialing the 4-digit number on a 10-digit PIN pad. So there you have specified complexity. Now, specified complexity in every realm of experience only comes from intelligent agencies, whether we find it in the form of a hieroglyphic inscription or in the form of computer. Go on, go ahead.
I mean, it's like a sort of, I don't mean to importune your motives, but it's like a sort of half a lesson in information theory and then like a massive jump in logic. Like, for example, DNA, which is the information you're talking about,
exactly.
Right? DNA, like 98, it's you pick your number, but a lot of it is junk DNA, right? It's meaningless rubbish.
I would disagree with that.
Okay. The biologists that I've read tell me that there's a great deal of DNA in any. Well, I kind of there was a lot come through, so let me go through. So, I think the point where I felt like I had to interrupt was when you said, we know that everywhere where we get specific information, you called it. I can't remember exactly what you called it. Everywhere we get distinct information that carries sort of deliberate knowledge, that must be an intelligent design. That's a massive leap in logic, and also you presuppose the conclusion, because what you're supposed to be proving is that intelligence design did evolution, but you've just used that as part of your argument.
Clarify for you, because that's not quite what I said. So when we're dealing with history, when we're looking back at the past, events that happened millions or billions of years ago, we obviously can't reconstruct the past. We can't repeat the past because it's already happened. It's in the past. So we have to use an inferential method called inference to the best explanation. Charles Lyell was a famous 19th century geologist, and he published a landmark classic in the history of science called Principles of Geology, in which he insisted that if you want to explain events in the remote past, one should let one's present experience of cause and effect guide one's search for the best explanation. Lyell's dictum was the present is the key to the past. When we look at the information storage, processing, and retrieval mechanisms in the cell, we find that and we try to explain the origins of that information content, which have defined a specified complexity. We know in every realm of experience, or uniform repeated experience of the cause and effect structure of the world, that kind of information, that quality of information content, comes exclusively from intelligent agencies.
It's not true, because we've got natural selection, and that's the big disproving one. So you've taken out the big disproving one and said, I don't believe it. We've got a whole wealth of, you know, the game of life, right? John Conway.
I do.
Okay, so the game of life is basically, it's like a grid, it's an infinite grid of squares, and there are certain rules. When a square is lit up, I think you've got 3 squares lit up next to you, then your square lights up, and there are various rules for turning these squares off and on. Okay? And that was John Conway, as a Cambridge mathematician, just set this up. And he went into it, and he found that you had all these emergent properties that came out of it. You had all this information that came out of nothing, came out of the basic environment. So John Conway's example would give that away. We had gliders, people put in random things and they get these things called gliders which go across the screen. So there's all sorts of examples of random processes, random walks, giving rise to either actual information or seemingly meaningful information. Right?
Okay, let's deal with your points there. So natural selection is the mechanism you pointed to as a generator for information in biology.
Yeah.
In natural selection obviously doesn't generate anything, it just preserves the successful...
No, that's not true, there's mutations. There are mutations.
Yeah, but that's not... But natural selection itself preserves the successful gene variants.
Okay,
right.
As part of the theory of natural selection, there are offspring that are born with new genetic information.
Exactly.
Right? Well, mutations, and some of those are successful and some are unsuccessful.
Right.
The process of natural selection encompasses through from mutation to survival and reproduction.
Exactly. So, one question we can ask is, what explains the origins of, say, protein structures in the cell? We find in the cell, life is governed by proteins, and proteins form parts of biochemical pathways. They are involved in macromolecular machines in the cell, and so forth. And one question that we can ask, and I think intelligent design and the neo-Darwinian proposition make competing predictions which compete with one another. One is if the neo-Darwinian conception of how life came about is correct.
Well, that's no. See, this is again. It's unfortunately it's a trick, right? To accuse Darwinians of having anything to say about the origins of life, but they don't. They have a lot to say about the origin of species. Okay. They have a lot to say about the evolution of life. But the idea that science has got an answer to the beginning of life is you're basically being dishonest.
Two points there. Firstly, I was using origins of life in a sort of more broader sense, as in the origins of life on Earth as we know it, origins of complex life and so forth. Secondly, actually prebiotic selection is a proposed mechanism of evolution, which is a form of attempting to explain it in view of some selection type mechanism. But in any case, I'm not setting up a false dichotomy, evolution is wrong, therefore intelligent design. Rather, intelligent design, I'm arguing, is an explanation for the origins of life. But I would argue that there's also an explanation for what happens after that as well. So when we're dealing with the origins of protein structures, for example, we know that the proteins are formed from subunits called amino acids, right? And there's 20 different types of amino acids used in proteins, and the sequential arrangement of the amino acids determines how a protein will collapse into its 3-dimensional structure. And one question that we can ask is, say you take, for example, let me give an illustration. Take an amino acid residue, a chain of amino acids, 150 amino acids. Well, how many ways are there of arranging those amino acids, right? There's 20 types of amino acids, there's 20 to the 150th power of possible ways of arranging those amino acids. One question we can ask is, out of all those possibilities, how many are functional and how many are gibberish, right? So there's 20 raised to the 150th power. That's the number of possible ways of arranging the amino acids, am I right?
Is it permutation or a combination? I mean,
that's the number of
Can you reuse the same? Can you reuse the same amino acid twice?
Sure. I mean, you can have multiple amino acids in the same. All right then. Yeah. I mean, many proteins have multiple amino acids multiple times. But if it turns out that there's a relative abundance of functional and stable protein structures in this vast combinatorial space, if you will, then it seems quite plausible that by a neo-Darwinian chance and necessity mechanism, you could stumble upon the sequences which convey function that actually collapse into a stable and functional structure. If it turns out, on the other hand, that there's an astronomical rarity of stable and functional protein structures in that combinatorial space, then it seems that a blind search would not be able to find those islands of function in that sea of meaningless
So
space.
again, this is a classic setup, but dressed up with quite good language. So it's like a classic thing where I deal you 6 cards, right? And you look at these cards and you say, my God, what is the probability of you dealing me a 2 of hearts, a 3 of spades, a 6 of clubs, a six of diamonds, and a jack of hearts, and a queen of clubs? Say, my God, what's the probability? The probability is astronomically small. Yes, it is, but you got it now, right? We only can have this conversation. We can only have this discussion in a world in which, by chance, we found the amino acids randomly put themselves together in that way. There are countless other worlds, exoplanets, where that didn't happen, and they're just not having this conversation there, right? Because we can only have this conversation in the one where it works.
Congratulations, you've just destroyed the entire basis for inferring common ancestry from the molecular evidence. So one of the mainstream arguments for common ancestry is the nested hierarchical distributions of point mutations and so forth, insertions and so forth. And the basis for inferring common ancestry is improbability, and it's specified complexity. It's a form of specified complexity reasoning. So you're using a double standard here.
I can't tell whether you're trying to make a point or trying to use long words.
No, I'm saying you said that you cannot use the argument for specified complexity because there's lots of arrangements which are equally improbable. And so you can generate much improbability by chance. No one's contesting that.
Right.
In fact, with evolution, all the main arguments for evolution are based upon probabilistic reasoning. You infer that it's extraordinarily unlikely that you would find the same insertions at different points in these different organisms.
No, that's not all the arguments, and there's plenty of other arguments. Like, for example, I'm sure that you accept microevolution, right? You accept specification, you accept the fact that, because it's pretty well documented.
I'm just pointing out the double standard in your reasoning here, because
it's not a double standard.
I mean, you criticise specified complexity because...
I didn't criticise specified complexity. I criticised the argument that's saying, hey, look, we've got this special thing in this universe. This must be selected. This must be intelligent design. I'm saying, well, actually, no, because this is, of course, we have that sort of moment of life, we have that moment of randomness in this one, because otherwise we don't get to have this conversation. This is the only one in which we get to have the conversation. The places where we don't have that random chance, we don't have the conversation.
John Leslie, Christian philosopher, responded to that. It's usually applied in terms of cosmological fine-tuning. It's called the anthropic principle. And John Leslie put forward this thought experiment where he said, imagine that you're blindfolded and you're taken before a group of riflemen, and the riflemen all fire, you hear all the machine guns going off, or the rifles going off, and then your blindfold's taken off and you're still there. And you think, oh, I shouldn't expect to be dead, because if I was dead, I wouldn't be here asking why I'm not dead. That's John Leslie's response to that. But that's basically
it makes literally no sense.
You haven't just because we are here to observe that we're here doesn't mean there's no explaining to do for why we're here.
No. How many planets do you think there are in the universe?
Many billions.
Many billions. So something that was a billionth of a probability, it was 1 billionth unlikeliness, it would happen, right?
Right, but you can.
And given that we have probably billions of years to go back in and to do this stuff in, you would expect that to happen,
and this is why there's a need for a universal probability bound. So William Dembski put forward this idea of a universal probability.
We can have a normal conversation. We're not.
Okay, I'm going to unpack these terms and explain what I mean.
Okay.
So if you take, for example,
Is the belief in God so complex, so unavailable that you have to use language specifically designed to either give you a sheen of scientific credibility or confuse the opponent?
I said I was going to unpack my terms,
Okay.
just like I did previous terms. Let me unpack what I mean. So when we're dealing with an ATM machine, for example, there's a such thing
You
as...
can't say ATM machine, the M stands for machine. It's automated teller machine.
Okay, you know what I mean. So you have say the bank gives you 3 trials before it locks you out of your account. 3 trials to get the bank card right. So by random search, you've got 10,000 ways of dialing a 4-digit number.
Right.
On a random search, it's astronomically more likely you'll fail than that you'll succeed.
Yep.
Right? Because you don't have adequate probabilistic resources. So what's the maximum number of probabilistic resources that the universe affords? That's what I mean by universal probability bound. And do you know how many subatomic particles are in the universe?
Why would I know that?
It's estimated by physicists to be about 10 to the 80. How many seconds have passed
It's 10 to the 80 particles.
Right. Yeah.
Doesn't sound like enough.
That's the mainstream view. And the observable universe is commonly understood as 10 to 80 subatomic particles. The amount of time since the Big Bang is estimated to be about 10 to the 16 seconds. And the time it takes light to traverse the smallest distance is about 10 to the 40. But multiplying those factors together, you can set up a universal probability bound, which is estimates have varied, but it tends to be around 10 to 150th power. Anything beyond 10 to 150th power, the universe does not allow you to get that by chance because you don't have the adequate probabilistic resources. And I think even with...
Sorry, what? You've taken the number of particles and multiplied by the number of seconds in the
and the time
universe.
it takes light to traverse the smallest
And the
distance
light-
corresponds, if you multiply those factors together, it corresponds to the number of discrete events that can have taken place conceivably in the universe.
No, it doesn't, because they interact with each other. There's emergent features. There's second and third level properties. There's a whole bunch of things that go on that aren't just atoms moving around in time.
Yeah, that's the maximum number of events that could have taken place in our universe.
But what about all the emergent features? Like, what about all the abstract properties that you've got 2 particles, right? They can do the things, but then they can be arranged like this. They can be arranged like that. They can be arranged like they've got multiple forms of arrangement. It's infinite, right?
It's the number of discrete events that can have taken place.
But that's not important. It's the way that they're arranged. Human beings and life, the amino acids talking about, are arrangements of particles.
Do you acknowledge the concept of the universal probability bound?
I've never even heard of it.
Okay, well, there's a concept of universal probability bound.
But I don't accept the idea that you need to understand the universal probability distribution or limit or whatever you called it in order to know God or in order to believe in God is profoundly silly, because there's countless people here. I don't believe they all know about it, and I'm the last person to hear about it, right?
Let me give you another illustration of how how the concept of probabilistic reasoning works when we're dealing with this argument. So take, for example, just to give a simple example, the evolution of the whale. Right, I'm going to talk about population genetics. Population genetics, for those of you who don't know the term, is the mathematical expression of neo-Darwinism, and it's basically yes, it is.
It's just
population genetics basically takes into account the known genetic mutation rates, the known generation turnover times, and the known estimated population sizes, and tries to work out what's the waiting time for a mutation to occur in the population and then become fixed, from going from being the lone individual out there to becoming the norm that's established in the population. Now, take for example the whale, which is understood the whale is thought to have evolved from terrestrial mammals. The terrestrial mammal is Pakicetus, which is a fully terrestrial mammal. You go down this series into Hyas, Ambulocetus, Protocetus, all the way down to Dorodon Basilosaurus. In the space of 4 or 5 million years. It's very, very abrupt transition in the fossil record. Now, looking at the equation of population genetics, so first of all, what do you require to get from a terrestrial mammal to a fully aquatic whale? Well, you would need a kind of current heat exchange system, because the testes are inside the body. You need a ball vertebra instead of a sacral vertebra, because the tail has to, instead of going side to side like a dog's tail, goes up and down. You need to have a reorientation of the fetus. You need a special lung surfactant, because when whales dive and come back to the surface, the lung needs to re-expand so very quickly. You need...
and you think the first generation of whales were doing that? I think the first generation of whales had all those features.
Let me finish. You need the forelimbs have to be transformed into flippers and so on. You need reduction of the hind limb. And there's a whole range of things that need to happen. The fully aquatic whales that possess all those features exist only about 4 million years after the fully terrestrial mammals. So you have a very narrow window of time in the fossil record, if you take the fossil record seriously, which I do. Now, Jewett and Schmidt, a very classic paper in 2008 in Journal of Genetics, they looked at hominid populations, and they wanted to see how long would it take to get a two-step coordinated mutation in a hominid lineage with the assumed breeding population size of 20,000 individuals per generation. And they calculated that in a hominid lineage, it would take 216 million years for a two-step coordinated mutation, where you require two mutations to happen together to affect a new function, to get a new function. Now, in whales, Richard Sternberg, who's an evolutionary biologist in America, looked at, he used their equations to work out how long it would take in whales, and he calculated that it would take approximately 43.4 million years. Guess what? You have about 4 million years for the entire transition. If you take, for example, just one of these changes, the counter-current heat exchange system, because in mammals, if the testes fail to descend and they're not cooled, you get sterility, which is an evolutionary dead end. So you have to cool down the gland, which in whales is done by in a manner akin to a modern refrigeration system, by shunning cool blood from the tail flukes through a nexus of arteries and veins that dissipates the heat from the gland, and so the testes are cooled down. Now, if you imagine just two mutations are necessary to get that transition, that's going to take you 43.4 million years. You've got about 4 million years to get the entire transition. That's the problem. That's what I mean by probabilistic resources that are at one's disposal.
So, right. I mean, it's like a biology lecture. I mean, like, so you take the fossil record seriously. It did happen, right? You're not going to presuppose the conclusion. So we accept specification. We accept improbable events. They happen.
Right.
So what's the problem?
But they're not simply improbable events. It's not the quantity of the complexity, but the quality of the complexity that's important. So when we're dealing with biology, we are dealing with specified complexity, things which are not only improbable, but conform to some independently given pattern. So for example, if you look at Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, you see the president's face is carved into the cliff face there. And we infer that that's the product of agency, not of wind and erosion, because they conform to some independently given pattern. That's what we mean by specified complexity. And when we're dealing with, I just gave you an example of irreducible complexity, but the testes in whales being inside the body, and you need the counter-current heat exchange system, the inter-abdominal system.
So your contention is that God came to Earth and sorted out the testicles of whales?
I maintain that there are points in the history of life where you have infusions of information into the biosphere.
Okay. And you think it's more likely that an extraterrestrial spiritual super being did that than anything else?
I think that the most causally adequate explanation is intelligent design.
And you believe that physical intelligence design or spiritual, otherworldly intelligence design?
I don't believe that the biological evidence on its own gets you to a transcendent greater, but it certainly does get you to agency.
So this intelligent thing is coming to Earth, right? Whatever it was, 4 million years ago?
Well, I think there's multiple infusions throughout the history of life.
So let's just work on this process, right? So this thing, lands on Earth. What goes to terrestrial mammals and rewires them?
The whale transition occurred about 50 million years ago.
Okay, so what do they do in this 50 million years? I mean, how does that process go? I'm not being facetious. Like, you're saying that something physical happened, right? There were generations of terrestrial mammals that went into being whales. What does he do? Like, cut them up, reprogram them? How does that work? Let's talk about, you're a scientist, let's talk about the physicality of that.
Sure, I mean, that's the question of the modus operandi of design. I think that we can infer design without knowing anything about the modus operandi of design, how the design came to be implemented.
Without knowing that, it's a bit suspicious, isn't it?
I'm offering a theory of design detection, not a theory of design implementation.
But if you're doing design detection, you would think that you would find the method of design. You would detect that somewhere, right?
For example, imagine that the astronauts found a hieroglyphic inscription on the backside of the moon. They might have no idea what tools were used or how it came to be there. I think they would be able to
infer that. You would look at the chip marks. We would look around the place. There might be a chisel left somewhere. There might be a hammer. You'd be able to infer things about it. In archaeological sites, we infer things about what we find there, right?
Yeah, they don't have to necessarily infer that's the case in order to infer design. They would be able to infer design without knowing what instruments were used.
Bare minimum. They've got the ability to reprogram DNA. Whatever the method is for reprogramming DNA, they have the ability to code and encode and decode DNA. Does that not strike you as totally insane? The fact that you could go in a whole animal and you could reprogram every cell in that animal in one go, and not only of that animal, but of every animal of that type, you would reprogram all of them. They have that. We're talking about that level of ability, that level of
Well, if
knowledge.
we're dealing with transcendent God, which is my position, then I
No,
don't
we're
see
not.
where
That's
the problem.
presupposing the conclusion.
No, I'm saying if I'm positing a transcendent God,
You're positing the designer.
Yeah, exactly. But when I deal with the physical sciences, then we start adding.
But we haven't established a non-physical world. So you can't use a non-physical world.
As I said, it's a cumulative case. As for establishing a non-physical world, I mean the what?
So as part of this cumulative case, you believe that there was a designer, a creative intelligence that turned terrestrial animals into whales. Okay? Reprogrammed mammals into whales. We haven't yet talked about anything spiritual. We haven't yet established anything godlike or infinite power, right? So you have posited, with no evidence, a thing which can look into the cells of every animal of one type and retype their DNA. That's the contention. And because we have no non-spiritual world, this is a physical process. Because you can't bring spirituality into this right now, because that's what we're driving towards. God is the conclusion. God can't be a premise. So it has to be a physical process. So somebody has to be there with that whale, reprogramming them in order for it to be physical, or bombarding them with gamma radiation from across the universe in order to specifically knock out the correct electron to change the DNA. I mean, it's a preposterous supposition, right? It's far more ridiculous than the whale was just unlikely, very, very unlikely, or the science has got the dates wrong, or the fossil record has been disrupted, or a scientist made a mistake, or God forbid, you're being slightly dishonest. Like, surely those are much more likely than than gamma radiation coming in across the, because otherwise you want a physical being doing that, right?
When we're dealing with the origins of the universe, whatever brought the universe into being must.
No, you're trying to establish that. You can't use that in your argument.
I said whatever brought the universe into, or do you deny the universe at the beginning?
We're not talking about that. Again, you're bringing in quite controversial ideas. You're inserting them by the back door.
If the universe had a beginning, then whatever brought the universe into being must be transferable.
You've just done cosmological argument in one sentence.
But you're excluding things which are non-natural.
Yes.
And I'm saying that there's no basis for that, because whatever brought the universe into being must be transtemporal spaces of material, and by that we mean non-natural.
You are trying to introduce the cosmological argument, which is like 3,000 years of debate, by the back door, and saying the universe must have an unmoved mover. I mean, it must do. You're not even having that conversation. Right? That's highly controversial.
Yeah, I'm happy to discuss it if you like.
But you would agree that, like, without evidence, we should suppose that we live in a physical universe, devoid
we
of.
do live in a physical universe,
Yeah,
but there's also
okay,
a transcendent reality, I would argue.
But you're in the process of arguing that. You can't bring that in halfway through without any evidence. So without evidence for a non-physical universe, without evidence for a non-material universe, let's stick to the material universe. At this stage, you've got a cosmic sniper rifle shooting gamma radiation across the universe. Otherwise, you've got this person or this thing landing on planet Earth and changing whales.
As I said, intelligent design on its own gets you to intelligent agency. It does not.
We haven't got to intelligent
Let
design.
me finish explaining, and then I'll let you respond. Intelligent design on its own gets you to the reality of a conscious, rational, deliberative agency as an explanation for biological complexity. However, to establish that intelligent agency is God or transcendent creator requires some further legwork, and I'm happy to do that with you if you would like.
No, we haven't done creative design.
Yeah, as I said, it's a cumulative case.
Right, but part of your cumulative case is the idea that there's good evidence that there's a creative design,
Exactly.
and I'm saying no, there isn't.
Well, you haven't given a basis for that.
I have, because if you have creative design, you have to have a mechanism for that, right? And I'm saying, let's think about what mechanisms, given what we know about the world, given that nothing new has been established.
But you're assuming we don't know there's supernatural agencies.
I am assuming that. I think that's a bet. I think that's a. Wait, you would need to. I agree.
Yeah, and I was in the process
the burden of proof. The burden of proof.
Responding to you.
No, but you see, it's a classic thing. You can't use the conclusion as a premise, right?
I haven't done that.
Okay, but one of the conclusions is spirituality, is a spiritual domain, a non-physical domain. So you can't bring that into your argument when we're talking about intelligent design. So let's talk about intelligent design without bringing in a spiritual realm.
Let me respond to that. So I would argue that the existence of a spiritual realm or a non-material realm is established by virtue of other independent lines of evidence. And so that would be my response.
So what you're trying to, so you're basically owning up to the fact that you introduced by the back door a pretty big piece of premise, which was spirituality.
There was evidence for that, and I was in the process of giving you some of that evidence.
So you want to do, so let's fall back and see if there's a possibility of a spiritual world.
I mean, whatever brought the universe into being must exist outside of time, space, and matter.
You're just stating the cosmological argument in one go.
Right.
That's controversial, right?
Let's start.
There are plenty of scientists who don't believe that the universe has any beginning.
Okay, let's respond to that then. Okay, let's deal with the philosophical arguments the universe had a beginning to start with. Okay, so do you accept that you cannot traverse an infinite distance? There's no such thing as a quantitative infinite. Do you agree with that?
I think it's a completely meaningless question, and B, totally outside the scope of a normal human being to know. I mean,
there's a conceptual logical problem with saying there's a quantitative infinite. Let me give you an illustration.
Well, if it's discrete, if you can have finite spaces within that infinite, you can do it, which you do have on a number line. So there are ways around it. Like you got inverses as well. So don't worry. Like there's ways around it.
I mean, if there was an infinite amount of time before the present, we'd never have arrived at the present. If you take, for example, imagine that you're playing tug of war and there's two teams, Team A and Team B, and both have an infinite number of players. And imagine that on Team A, half the people die of heart attacks spontaneously. The room remains tense. We know that's absurd. You cannot traverse an infinite distance. There's no such thing as a quantitative infinite.
Right. The problem is, right, and this conversation is unfortunately almost certainly going to go nowhere. The problem is that you've got to do a lot of legwork on time, right? Time is the big problem with all this stuff. Like we talk about infinite time. Like, once you remove time from the equation, certainly once you accept that time is not necessarily one way. We have an experience of time being one way, mostly due to the second law of thermodynamics, although it's quite controversial, and I'm sure my philosophy of physics professor would say that I should. But time is not simple, right? We have an experience of going one way through time. That's not necessarily the only way you can experience time. There are all sorts of positive ideas where you can go back and forward in time and you can kind of move around in it. With that in mind, it's very difficult to talk about the idea of before, because if you don't have time, you can't do before. You have to watch your language.
Sure. Okay. So that's the question, the objection. Well, if we don't have time, how can you talk about causality? Because causality presupposes temporality. The problem with that rejoinder, the philosophers of, is that your point?
Yeah, I mean, causality, right, if you run time one way, you have causality, right? If you experience time one way, but equally you could be experiencing time the other way, and you wouldn't experience the same type of causality.
I mean, you have in mind ideas like the oscillating theory of the universe.
Can I just jump in here? Yeah. Can we each of you have a 5-minute summation?
I don't have 5 minutes of summation.
Try just kind of wrap up what has happened in the last half hour in 5 minutes, and then you have 5 minutes of what you think's happened, okay? So because we do need to bring this to a closure.
Yeah.
If you could do that, go ahead.
So I'm going to be a bit cheeky, and I'm going to use my 5 minutes and probably end up taking some of your 5 minutes as well. Kind of trying to present that it's not as simple as the idea of like an aggregate case for God, where you slowly step through and you kind of put bits together. I think it's important to introduce that the things that would suggest that there isn't a spiritual realm, right? Like we have causality, like the physical universe follows rules, and it always follows those rules, and we continue to find more rules underneath that explain more and more, which suggests that we don't have some spiritual universe impacting us. We have the problem of evil happening. We have the problem of children being born with AIDS, right? The idea of a God. We have the problem of knowledge. We have the dilemma of whether God, the morality dilemma, because God is, if he's perfect, he's got to be moral. So there's all sorts of other problems that you're not introducing. If we had a God, what would we expect to see in this world? That's another question you've got to ask for your probability. You look at the laryngeal nerve that in humans goes underneath the heart and comes back up to the voice box. That's not what you'd expect to see if there was a God, right? That's evidence against. So, I feel like you've basically tried to browbeat me with long words, and I think that the audience may have seen the same thing, if I'm honest with you. But the reality of it is that it is not good enough to just say, well, I accept a spiritual realm, and then use that spiritual realm to do all sorts of intellectual heavy lifting in the physical world. Because you have to explain how God's getting around. Where's he going? What's he made up of? How's he interacting with our universe? How's he getting stuff into our brain? There's a whole bunch of unsolved problems that we just take for granted because we live in a culture where religiosity is accepted, which is a very good thing. If you're interested in my opinion, I think that's ultimately a good thing. But because religiosity is very much in the water and in the air, we don't ask questions like, how's God sending messages to humans? Like the human brain is physical. Where's it resonating? We should be able to pick that up on an MRI machine. So I think that you got to ask yourself the other side of that aggregate question. I think if you ask yourself that question, you will find, and hopefully some of the people that watch this, I expect not, will find that it's much more complex and there are far more arguments against if you go looking for them with an honest, open heart. So I guess I don't know if that's 5 minutes or not, but finish on that.
All right. Well, we started looking at the concept of specified complex information in the cell in particular, and we looked at the historical method, the historical abductive method, which is the inference of the basis of all scientific reasoning about the past. The present is the key to the past. We know that all of our cause and effect experience, or uniform empirical experience of the cause and effect structure of the world, the information content comes from only one type of source, that is intelligent agency. And so when we find information content in the realm of biology, encoded in digital form, we infer that the best explanation for that is that it too arose by virtue of intelligent agency. I talked about protein folds and the fact that you find that the sequential arrangement of the amino acid subunits is what causes the protein to collapse into its three-dimensional structure. And looking at the rarity, the astronomical rarity of protein folds within that vast array of combinatorial possibilities. Doug Axe, for example, in 2004 in the Journal of Molecular Biology, did a use of a technique called site-directed mutagenesis, where he randomly altered a protein, the amino acids of a domain of a particular protein called beta-lactamase, in order to look at how prevalent the functional stable structures were in that combinatorial space. And according to his work, the ratio of functional to non-functional folds is 1 in 10 to the 77th power. To that in context, there's only 10 to the 65 atoms in the galaxy. I talked about whale evolution and the fact that the testes are inside the body, and so you need a counter-current heat exchange system, an intra-abdominal counter-current heat exchange system. And I looked at population genetics, the mathematical expression of neo-Darwinism. And since many events in the history of life require simultaneous changes in order to get a new function that can be selected upon, it's simply a beggar's belief that you can that you could get that by a chance and necessity mechanism within the probabilistic resources at one's disposal. We also I looked at the fact the universe had a beginning, and the fact that philosophically you cannot traverse an infinite amount of time. The universe had a beginning philosophically. There's also scientific reasons to think the universe had a beginning as well. And since our universe had a beginning, then the cause of that universe must be trans-temporal, spaceless, and material, and also must be immensely intelligent because of the fine-tuning of our universe, and also must be personal, because to have if the creator of our universe exists necessarily, then to have a contingent effect, to have an internal cause produce a temporal effect, you must have the ability to freely choose to create at a particular moment in time, because an internal set of necessary and sufficient conditions results in the effect being there from eternity as well. So that's how I'd sum up that, and I don't think really my colleague in dialogue has responded to any of the points I raised.